All right. How we doing today? Everybody awake?
Yeah.
I feel like after lunch, it's like, cool, after lunch, all these carbs, and then JavaScript, and all of you are like, oh, man. Like, we could probably just, like, close up shop if we don't want to do that. We can just go to sleep. I can give you the code and the slide deck, and you can just kind of go through it on your own. No, if you're here for the War is Over, the workshop on Webpacker, you are in the right place. Man, I'm so excited to be here. This is, like, kind of surreal for me. This is my first, like, conference. And so, like, it's kind of crazy to be like, I'm at RailsConf? Like, what? It was like a feeling when you're like, oh, you got accepted. I'm like, I got accepted. What? Like, it's kind of crazy. But yeah, my name is June. You can call me Young June. That's what my friends tend to call me. It's just like a nickname. It originated like a couple years back. So if you want to hear that story at the next Pomodoro, I take 5-minute breaks after every 25 minutes on. You can come talk to me about that. But here's a little bit about me. I'm a instructor. I'm a developer and then an instructor at the Turing School of Software and Design. I help launch their front-end engineering program, which is really cool. Something I'm really proud of. And coming from Rails and then learning JavaScript was kind of crazy. If you want to know a little bit more about me, you can find me on the internet under Joshua June. Yeah, just talk a little bit about me, just so you know that I'm an actual person. I like to rock climb. Do you have any climbers out here? Yes. I saw somebody go like this. I'm like, yeah, that's me. I'm not the person in the green shirt. I don't know who that is. But that's me climbing a rock. I also ride an electric skateboard. So if you like are into like e-skateboards, we should definitely talk. So that's me riding in downtown Denver. This is my awesome wife. My wife's real cool. Sometimes you just gotta be like okay with being the reacher in the relationship. So I'm gonna own that. So that's me. Yeah, so that's my wife. She's really cool. We just added a little dog to our family. So that's Leon. He's 8 weeks old. That's him sleeping on me. He's really like smart. Like
Leon, sit.
8 weeks old.
Down.
And you can go down like.
Good boy.
What? Like that's crazy. So that's Leon. Man, I miss that guy. He's like so cute. If you're not a dog person, it's okay, I guess. But maybe I should have brought my dog, and maybe you could have met him, and maybe change your mind. I'm hoping I could change your mind, just like how I'm trying to change your mind with JavaScript. Cool. Goals for today. This is what I'm trying to accomplish, and is what I'd love for us to do. If we leave today doing any of these things, I think it's a win. Okay. So the developers hopefully understand the benefits of Webpacker. Developers will not throw tomatoes at me when JavaScript comes on the screen. So 5 minutes into the conference already like making fun of JavaScript. So I'm like, please don't save any tomatoes and throw them at me. That'd be really awesome. And hopefully developers will see that testing JavaScript isn't as bad as you actually think it is. So that's what I hope to leave with today. Half of today's talk will just be us talking about Webpacker, what it does, how it makes our life easier as developers, and then we'll hop into like a live code. With the live code, there's gonna have multiple sections, so at some point if you get lost, you can check out a branch when you've cloned it down, and then have all the code for you. If you learn better with taking notes, I would definitely encourage you just to pull out a notebook and just to start writing out some code, because I feel like when you're writing, things tend to synthesize a lot more than you actually typing it out, right? Speaking of which, I like to start my classes with a warm-up question. I used to teach like 6th grade, so we typically started our classes like this. So what I'd love for you to do is, if you have a notebook right now and a pen, please pull that out to write. A computer's fine if you want to type it out, pull up your notes app. But what I'd love for you to do is take 5 minutes, and I want you to talk about what are some of the frustrations you had with JavaScript inside of Rails in particular. Not like in any other Webpack config or any other like framework, just inside of Rails. Like what was the frustrating pieces for you while you were learning JavaScript or writing JavaScript? Answers like, because it sucks, is not constructive. So I would love for you to dig deep. And you have 5 minutes. So I would like you to take this next 5 minutes for yourself, just kind of reflect on some of the things that are difficult about JavaScript, and then we will come back. So take 5 minutes and go ahead and do that. Thumbs up. Okay, it looks like everybody's done. Awesome. Thanks for doing that. Now I'm going to make you do one thing that you're probably not going to like. Sorry. But I'd love for you to turn to the person next to you and share what you wrote. So you got 5 minutes to do that. I'm going to walk around and just hear some of your grievances, hear some of the things you don't like, and we're going to discuss that. So let's take 5 minutes and do that right now. Let's go. Cool. I actually think we're about wrapping up. Why don't we start bringing it in? Let's go ahead and start wrapping up your conversations. Let's start bringing it in. Cool. Man, there was some really good stuff in there. Does anybody want to just share some of the frustrating pieces? I'd love to hear them. I think a big part of this lesson is to hopefully show you that the things you are frustrated about are completely valid.
Yeah, it just seems so disconnected from the beautiful organization that Rails provides. And you start adding a little bit more of the most basic JavaScript code, and it's I get lost. How do I organize?
Absolutely. So I think that's valid. So if you didn't hear that, the frustration is where does this go? You go from something like having a model, a view, and a controller. It's very in compartments. Hey, this is where it goes. And not only that, the errors will tell you. The most beautiful part about Rails is hey, uninitialized constant. Shoot. Hey, you don't have the ERB file. Great. There's no route. Cool. So you can follow those errors. And then you get to JavaScript, and it's well, good luck, buddy. You're where am I? What year is it? And you're just really frustrated because you've gone from this amazing thing to this thing that's no longer there. So that's valid. What else? Anybody want to share something that's oh, this is really difficult?
I think on top of that is just organizing proper JavaScript, do I use prototypes or constructor functions or classes or what? I don't even know what they are.
Absolutely. So that's valid too. So just the inner workings of the actual language. Am I going to use we'll use an object iterator here. Do I am I gonna how do I even iterate over an object, right? Ruby has these amazing enumerables that you can go through, and it's just filter, map, reduce, right? Good luck, there's no zip. You're oh shoot, So there's definitely, that's valid. That's completely valid. Let's do one more.
My case, I don't know if you have to.
Yes, I was hoping somebody was gonna say that. I was come on. Yeah.
Or do we just test and say if the user putting incorrect stuff, then hopefully it brings the error?
Absolutely. So I think testing for a lot of us is a big grievance, right? So we're going to definitely address a lot of these things today. So I came up with some of my top answers. Testing is the first one on the list, right? So that's not there. Errors are horrible, right? You can't follow them. Adding modules is also really difficult too. What if I wanted to add particular things? Can you imagine running your Rails app without your gem file, without bundler, without rake? That would be really difficult, right? So when you are in Rails, you don't have any of those things. You're I want to add this thing. It's well, is there a gem for it? But wait a minute, this is JavaScript. Why would I load a Ruby gem for this? That's gonna be really difficult to kind of manage, right? I think also I heard somebody say debugging is difficult, right? You miss pry all of a sudden. I don't have pry. Where does that live? And depending on what JavaScript environment you're in, there are equivalents to pry. It won't be as good as pry, but it's definitely something that helps, right? Because that's really awesome when you can throw a pry in there or a buy bug and just hit the line and ask what's actually going on here. We're not going to get too much into that today because that one in particular is there are a lot of environment stuff you have to set up, but it's definitely doable. So I think these things for me were really, in particular, frustrating, almost demoralizing too, because you're man, am I the problem? Are you the problem? Who's the problem here? And it's so, and maybe if I point at JavaScript, 3 fingers are pointing back at me, so I don't really know. That one was really cheesy. I got a dad hat earlier, so the dad jokes are coming out. So the problem, right? Real talk. Let's talk about the problem here. I think the real problem that we're dealing with is that Rails and JavaScript don't really mix very well. Okay, so let's just talk about initially. That's it. A lot of Rails developers, I think, oftentimes, even for me when I was first learning JavaScript, point out the fact that JavaScript is really frustrating, and I would agree with that. But I don't necessarily know the complete problem is just JavaScript itself. I really think the problem is learning JavaScript inside of Rails is not very fun. That's the problem. And I think where the problem begins to stem, if I were to look at it, I think it starts with the view. I think the view treats JavaScript kind of like it's a second-class citizen. If you talk about my experience in Rails, the biggest frustration I had was yeah, where did the files go? All these functions are just floating around. Also, how do I test this? I went from testing my models and my controllers and knowing exactly what's going on and where it's happening and why it's happening, to all of a sudden it could be any one of these functions. Like, how does that happen? And that file structure is hard to manage. And so what I would ask us to consider is maybe our JavaScript shouldn't just be considered an asset. At this point in development, especially in the front end, state management has become extremely difficult. JavaScript is doing so much now that it's not like a static asset. It's actually managing things. It deserves a test suite, right? Just like anything else. It's like you're programming, you're writing functions, they're doing some complex things, whether they're grabbing data, manipulating data, storing data, like you deserve a test suite. If you look at even the problem with Facebook's like timeline, aside from their data problems, but like Facebook's actual problem of like, hey, all these things are loaded onto your DOM, right? And I don't want to load all these things and add events to them because it's going to crash your browser. So I'm dynamically adding and removing things while you're going. And it's just this endless scroll, right? Like that problem is like a legit problem. And it can't just be managed by like an asset. If we're planning on writing modern JavaScript, the asset pipeline is not providing the tools that we need. That's just it. It's not necessarily just the tools, but I would say that JavaScript needs a better environment, right? JavaScript needs a better environment than the current asset pipeline. So like, I think the hardest thing for me learning JavaScript inside of Rails was that the best thing Rails gave me as a developer was a culture around testing, right? You learn Ruby, the first thing you get, mini test. And you're like, okay, cool. I can either write mini test or I can write RSpec, which one do you want? But you're gonna need to use one of them, right? And that was like super amazing for me. And when I was learning that, when I felt like I could test something, I knew I could get the problem done, right? I could fix the problem. I could solve any problem you wanted to give me. I could do that because I could test it. And I think that my favorite part of Rails is the Poro, right? Because the Poro is just straight unit tests. It's just simple Ruby object, not inheriting from anything else. Like, let's just test this thing. And when you don't have those tests, you don't have any confidence. And I think all of us as developers would agree with the fact that there's a very clear relationship between testing and code quality. Not that like if you test, your code's gonna be perfect, but if I look at your test suite, I should know exactly what's going on. And half the time you're running into the asset pipeline, you're like, what's going on here? I have no idea what's happening. Where am I? Like, who's transporting me out of this beautiful land of Rails into this like barren wasteland of the asset pipeline, right? And the problem is we're not really testing our JavaScript. And I would say that if we're not testing our JavaScript and our environment is not helping us get the job done, then maybe the problem isn't JavaScript. Maybe it's like our code and the environment we're in. So the thing that I want to focus on for the next 5 minutes, you'll discuss this with the person next to you. We'll take a 5-minute Pomodoro. We'll come back and discuss what we talked about. But I'd love for you to take 5 minutes to talk to the person next to you explicitly about this. How have you tested your JavaScript and UI in the past, and what made that process particularly difficult? Answers like, I don't know, I just did it, is not constructive. So I would love for you to dig deep. So again, take 5 minutes to do that, and then we'll come back, and then we will discuss, and then you will take a 5-minute break. Okay? So let's do that. I'm noticing our conversation is starting to die down, so I'm gonna bring it back. Man, so I heard some people just say, we don't test our JavaScript, and I'm like, hey, that's real. Like, like I know the pain, you know, like that's really frustrating. Like, especially coming from a place like Ruby and Rails, it's like that's our bread and butter, right? Like, I think if you look at like any application, the first thing we're judging like how legit or how good it is by the testing quality, right? And it's like, man, like this is something we're writing inside of Ruby on Rails, and all we're doing is like, we're either testing it from a high level, right? Or we're not testing it at all. So before I put you on your break, I want to go to this slide. I'm going to tell you a secret, okay? Also, I really love Jimmy Fallon, so I'm going to tell you a secret. I got a secret for you. You know, everybody's talking about Webpacker and like what Webpacker does, but I'm going to tell you the single most important thing Webpacker gives us as a Rails community and people who are trying to get into the front end. The most important thing it gives us is that it gives us the ability to unit test our JavaScript. Okay, so today, when we're done with this stuff, we're actually going to code it. We're going to live code it together. We're not even going to look at the browser, and we're going to be like, oh, cool, we have a working app. That's the goal today. It sounds ambitious. Some of you are like, I don't believe this guy. Who does he think he is? Like, it's going to, hopefully it'll work. Hopefully it does, please work. But and I think that I was having this conversation with some people today, or the other day, and the frustration surrounding testing JavaScript is that everything we're doing, if it's from like the capybara or the selenium level, is from the top, right? So it's the top looking down. Like, you shouldn't be testing that. That should be tested on the unit level, right? If we're testing something in units and very small isolated places and pieces, like, we can have a lot of confidence around like how our app is going to work. I see a lot of heads nodding. I'm like, yeah, right? Am I right? I hope I'm right. I would say that like that's the best place to like put your confidence in. Unit tests are extremely great because they're fast. They actually give us actual opportunity to refactor, right? If you look at the red-green refactor cycle, you get the thing to work, and then what do? You try to break it, and you go back to red, and then you get it to work, and it's better, and you go back to green. You actually can't do that if you're working from a top-down approach. Your JavaScript is not going to be scalable. It's not going to be fast. It's not going to be efficient because why? You can't test it. And it forces us to also understand the technologies we're using, how the DOM actually works, right? So when it comes from a debugging standpoint, not only is testing requiring us to understand our stack, but it helps us in debugging the actual problem. And also they're really cheap, right? If it's input-output, if that's the dream, right, then it's going to be really easy to run that test suite. It's not going to open up a browser, run the browser, and find the thing. Like, those are great tests. We need those tests. But I would say the more important piece we need to be focusing on is the bottom half of that pyramid, right? The unit test is the piece that we need to like make sure our applications work really well. So we kind of talked a little bit about UI and feature tests, right? The problem with them is they're slow. They're fragile. You change that class name, guess what? All your tests are broken. Or sometimes it doesn't even see it. As much as I love Capybara's like, I can't find the button, sorry. Like, shoot, right? And they're expensive. I mean, it's going to take you 15 minutes to run a test suite? Like, that's not maintainable. That's not scalable. That's 15 minutes of your time watching check marks. I mean, you get the dopamine hit of the green check mark, right? But after that, you're like, oh, man, now I got to wait for another 15 minutes for the rest of this thing to run. Cool. I've talked long enough. Let's take 5 minutes, come back. I want you fresh. We're going to continue this. We're almost through this portion, this piece, and then we'll get into the live code, okay? So 5 minutes, that's for you. If you want to grab coffee, you want to call your mom, feel free to do that. Cool, 5 minutes. Yeah. Yeah, if you like get to know me, I'm basically like a 6th grader. I'm just goofy, sorry. So we kind of left off talking about like feature tests. And so you might be asking yourself, wait, does that mean I shouldn't use the asset pipeline? And I would say just because it's shiny and new, just because Webpacker is shiny and new, doesn't mean that you have to use it. And that's coming from like a JavaScript developer, right? Like, we're like notorious for like, oh, it's a shiny new framework or library, and we like rush and run to it, right? And for you, like, it depends on what you're trying to do. What you need to ask yourself, like, what's the scale of my application? Is the logic, in my view, growing to the point where I need to separate concerns? I think that's the harder part, right? Is that the JavaScript seems coupled to our view, and there's no way to decouple them to test it, and that's really difficult. So you need to ask yourself, like, what do I need to do to move away from that if that's like the actual pain I'm starting to feel? The reality is that the asset pipeline is doing a lot for us already. So if you're asking yourself, do I need or should I not use the asset pipeline? I'd probably say no. You can use it and it's fine. You don't have to use Webpacker. So what does the asset pipeline actually do for us? It does a couple of really important things for us to like kind of understand like what's happening. It's going to concatenate all of our JavaScript, right? So the sprockets is going to go through and it's going to concatenate all our assets. It's going to make a main JavaScript, right? It's going to make a main CSS, and it's a single file. And the reason why it does that is to like make sure that our front end loads as fast as possible, and we're limiting our network requests. On top of that, it's going to fingerprint our stuff, right? So when you go to public, you'll see like your assets, and they'll be fingerprinted. So when you build or you like when you collaborate, they all disappear. You precompile, you get the same thing again. And it's also going to minify our code to remove all the spaces and just make it faster to run. And the one nice thing about the asset pipeline that it does for us is it allows us to use abstracted languages like Sass, things like CoffeeScript, things that we'd like to abstract, like the complexity of that like of JavaScript, and write in CoffeeScript allows you to do those things. Based on the scale of your app, that might actually be enough for you. So kind of the burning question we all have is like, what is Webpack then? Why do I care? I'm going to just kind of skip to the end. If you like want the TLDR, it basically does the same thing that the asset pipeline does. Webpack is a module bundler. So on the front and the back end, Node has supported this thing called modular design since the start, meaning you could move, or you can take parts of your JavaScript, put it in a separate file, require it. Like you could do that and import it. It's great, but that's not typically the case on the front end. If you've ever written JavaScript outside of Webpack, you'll notice that your scripts are going to look like this in the head. And like there's some stuff in there. It's a sadness.js, all this really sad stuff, right? That's like the typical, that's typically how it's run, like historically. So what Webpack does for us is it's going to build a dependency graph. It's going to look at all of your files that you're writing, where they're required, and it's going to look at that, and it's going to essentially output a single file. So you'll get a main.bundle.js. And what's really cool too is that it's really configurable. That's the really great part about Webpack itself, is that you get this single config file that's going to help you modularize and really like fine tune the things you'd like to do with your front end app. So the main parts of Webpack that you need to be considered, that you need to know about, is that it gives you an entry point. And what's cool about the entry point, that's where the app is going to start. The output is where you'd like to put your main bundle. It's going to give you the ability to put loaders in there. So when we talked about the asset pipeline and its ability to pull out and allow you to use languages that are abstracted like Sass and CoffeeScript, you can actually do that with Webpack. So if you wanted to use something like Sass or use JSX or handlebars, loaders is going to allow you to do that. Plugins is kind of the backbone of Webpack. What's cool about the plugins is, I had a gentleman in the back asking me about like, hey, I write code I write my JavaScript code, and that code is everywhere in every single view. That's really frustrating. With Webpack, you can do something called code splitting, where you can split and dynamically split your bundles. So when I go to your web application and I'm not an admin, I shouldn't be paying for admin code, right? Especially if I'm on a mobile device. What that allows me to do is to dynamically import that component when I need it. And so Webpack will support that. That's an ES6 nicety and a Webpack nicety, which is really, really neat. So we can limit our bundle sizes, and that's what the plugins do for us. So you might be asking then, how does Webpacker make my life easier? So Webpacker abstracts the JavaScript out of the traditional asset pipeline. And when I say out of, it's not necessarily out of. When you run assets precompile, it's actually going to compile and build your Webpack for you and throw that into the public portion of your file structure. So it just like outputs the same way it would in the asset pipeline. What's beautiful about this is we've been talking a lot about conceptual compression, right? And a lot of the frustrating pieces that like JavaScript developers deal with Webpack, you won't have to. Because when you bundle or create your Webpacker file, if you want to use whatever JavaScript framework or library you want to use, it's ready to go to production. So like, it's still using the traditional asset pipeline, but it's allowing you to write app-like JavaScript. So it moves that logic into a separate front-end application that allows the further control of your front-end app. It builds that environment for you, and you can actually do a lot of things with it. And that allows JavaScript to be in that better environment. I think that's really neat about the conceptual compression piece. That's why we love Rails so much, is because it's doing a lot of that stuff for us that we don't necessarily need to like configure or necessarily need to like absolutely know to be developers. So if you're like interested in the front end, Webpacker is a great way to like get into that and handle it. So you might be thinking to yourself, man, nobody cares. I really think that might be an appropriate response like 2 years ago, but it's 2018, and your user is getting mad because your app is slow and the page refreshed. And the reality of the situation is some of your users who are using your applications might be using this as a phone. That is an iPhone 4, if you were wondering. An iPhone 4. So take a look at these stats. This is the current attention span of human beings in 2017. Notice the attention span of the goldfish. I just want you to let that sink in just for a second, okay? All right, cool. This is the current internet traffic. If you look at 2017 in mobile, 52% of our interactions are mobile, okay? So like most of your, the people, your traffic, the people using your app is mobile. So at some point, we're not even gonna be talking about mobile web. It's just gonna become the web. There are more mobile internet users. And so it doesn't necessarily matter if our active record queries are extremely efficient if the front end is slow. All these stats point to the fact that if our front end is failing our users and we're not converting them, we're losing them. With things like Webpack and ES6, like I talked about, it allows you to speed up that front end piece, which is a lot of fun. And regardless of the hardware in the browser, we can do our best to accommodate these users. So let's talk about the front end stack. Today, this is the stack we're going to be using. We're going to be using Yarn, which is going to be our equivalent to Bundler. It's going to bundle all our NPM modules. We're going to be doing our state management and testing in React today. If you don't know React, you're going to have a great time learning it via tests. That's the best way to learn it, and we'll take our time. We're going to be using Airbnb's Enzyme to mount our components. We're going to be using Webpacker. We're using NPM and some modules, and then we'll also be using Jest. So what I want to talk about today is this part. Now, like I said before, I want to mention any of this stuff. The thing that makes all of this possible is going to be NPM and Yarn. And this is like the best parts and pieces you get with Webpack. Everybody talks about the Webpack config, but these two pieces are the pieces that are going to make your life inside of that JavaScript world a lot more enjoyable. NPM gives you the ability to pull in modules. It's like how you want to grab a gem, you can grab that gem and grab it. NPM is going to allow you to do that. Yarn is going to allow you to run tests, and it's going to allow you to bundle all those things. So like I said, NPM provides the modules. Yarn is our package manager. Jest is a framework agnostic testing framework we're going to be using today. It's by Facebook. A lot of cool things in that. And like I said, all this stuff is going to be set up for you. So before we go on our next Pomodoro, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you, I'll put the URL for the repo in there, and you can look at some of the prerequisites needed to run our app today. We'll be using Enzyme, which is a utility that allows us to manage and mount our React components. So that's a lot of cool stuff there. So the things that I want you to kind of know about are these. Ooh, that slide looks really bright. Made a mistake. Jest.fn is a way for us to mock our functions. Instance is a way for us to like almost treat our components like a class. So it's going to feel a lot like Ruby when you like make a new class of something and you call a function on it. Instance is going to allow us to do that. Enzyme gives us that. And then find is a way for us to just look for a particular button or CSS thing. So enough talking. I've talked a lot. Let's actually like code some stuff. So I don't know why that slide didn't go. All right, cool. The next slide just says let's code some stuff. Cool, there it is. So before I send us off to code, I'd like for you to